Billionaire CEO offers fruit to starving girl, then sees what's in her hand and freezes. The rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the city streets into mirrors of broken light. She stood there, a tiny figure in drenched pajamas, her trembling fingers clutching a worn butterfly brooch against her chest. Paul's hand paused mid-air as he offered her the apple. His breath caught. The brooch, it was the one. The very same he had given Claire all those years ago. Before ambition tore him away, now, staring into this little girl's frightened eyes, everything he had buried, the love, the guilt, the unbearable regret, came crashing back. And in that single heartbeat, Paul Durand knew. His past had found him. The city always felt colder when it rained. Paul Durand sat behind the wheel of his black Bentley, watching the windshield wipers sweep away the night in rhythmic strokes. Drops of water streaked down the glass like tiny rivers, blurring the neon signs and the hurried silhouettes darting along the sidewalks. Even through the insulated silence of his luxury car, Paul could sense the weight of the storm. As if the heavens themselves were remembering something they could no longer hold. He had just left another meeting, another dinner, another hollow conversation about mergers and acquisitions. After 60 years of life, 40 of them devoted to building an empire, Paul Durand had everything any man could want. And yet, he often found himself wondering why every victory tasted so bitter. At the red light, his gaze drifted absent-mindedly across the street. That was when he saw her. A small figure curled beneath the tiny awning of a grocery store. Alone, shivering, head bowed against the rain. At first, he thought perhaps it was just a shadow, or the distorted outline of an abandoned backpack. But as his eyes focused, he saw the fragile curve of her shoulders, the soaked strands of dark hair plastered against pale skin. The child. Paul's stomach tightened. She couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. Drenched, freezing, clutching her knees to her chest like she was trying to fold herself into nothingness. The light turned green, but his foot remained frozen on the brake. The cars behind him blared their horns, snapping him out of his trance. Without thinking, he flipped the turn signal and steered the Bentley to the curb. His heart beat louder than the rain as he grabbed the umbrella from the passenger seat and stepped into the storm. The wind slapped him instantly, cold and sharp, but he barely felt it. His eyes never left the tiny figure huddled beneath the awning. As he approached, she looked up. And for a moment, Paul Durand forgot how to breathe. Those eyes, large, frightened, the color of deep, ancient woods, hauntingly familiar. She flinched as he crouched down, his designer suit absorbing the rain like a sponge. "Hello," he said, softly, as if any sudden movement might shatter her completely. "Are you all right?" The girl didn't answer. She simply stared, her tiny frame trembling under the weight of the storm and something far heavier. Paul followed her gaze, noticing that she was clutching something tightly against her chest. His eyes narrowed. It was a brooch. A butterfly. Delicate wings encrusted with tiny stones that shimmered even beneath the dim store light. And as Paul stared at it, the years peeled away like fragile wallpaper. His vision blurred, not from the rain, but from the sudden flood of memory. The brooch was his. Or rather, it had been Claire's. Once. He had saved for months to buy it, back when money was tight, but dreams were endless, when their future had seemed certain. Before ambition whispered in his ear and pride led him down a road that never circled back. Now, here it was after 35 years. In the trembling hands of a little girl standing alone in the rain. Where did you get that?" Paul whispered, his voice almost breaking. The girl shrank back slightly, sensing the shift in his tone. Realizing his mistake, he softened his expression. "I'm sorry, it's just very special to me." Still, she said nothing, only clutched the brooch tighter, as if it was the only piece of safety she had left in the world. Paul's heart clenched. He couldn't leave her here, not like this. The thought of her spending another minute alone in the rain, hungry and terrified, made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt since Claire. "Are you hungry?" he asked gently. The girl's lips quivered. She gave the faintest nod. Without hesitation, Paul stood and entered the grocery store. The warmth inside hit him like a different world. Shelves lined with comforts he took for granted every day. He quickly grabbed a shiny red apple, a bottle of water, and a small pack of cookies. Minutes later, he returned to her side. Carefully, he handed her the apple first. She looked up at him again, her eyes filled with uncertainty, before reaching out with a trembling hand. As she bit into the fruit, Paul watched her, watched the hunger fade just slightly, watched her shoulders loosen as the immediate threat subsided. But behind her exhaustion, behind the shadows in her eyes, there was something else. Something he recognized too well. Abandonment. "My name is Paul," he said softly. "Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated. Then, in the tiniest voice barely louder than the rain, she whispered, "Sophie." "Sophie?" The name landed in his chest like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples he couldn't control. He swallowed, his throat dry despite the rain. "Sophie, do you have somewhere to go? Someone waiting for you?" The panic that flashed in her eyes was answer enough. "No one's looking for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Paul closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself. "All right," he said gently. "You don't have to be afraid. I won't leave you here." He extended his hand. She stared at it, then, after what felt like an eternity, slipped her tiny, freezing fingers into his. And in that instant, Paul Durand felt the weight of his entire life shift beneath him. Whatever storm had brought this little girl to him tonight, it had also awakened something long buried: regret, guilt, hope, and perhaps a chance for redemption. He led her carefully to the car, wrapping his coat around her trembling frame. As the Bentley pulled away into the rainy night, Paul couldn't stop glancing at her in the passenger seat, her small head resting against the leather, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the butterfly brooch. The brooch that would soon unravel a secret he'd never dared to imagine. The past wasn't finished with him yet. And neither, it seemed, was love. Chapter 1. The Butterfly Brooch. The gates of the estate opened with a soft hum, their motion smooth and practiced. Paul guided the Bentley along the winding driveway, headlights slicing through the rain-soaked night. The sprawling mansion loomed ahead, its stately silhouette softened by the blur of water streaking down the windows. Beside him, Sophie had drifted into a fitful sleep, her tiny frame curled beneath his heavy wool coat. Her damp hair clung to her forehead, and though her breathing had evened out, she clutched the butterfly brooch tightly in her small hand, as though, even in sleep, she feared it might slip away. Paul pulled the car to a gentle stop beneath the porte-cochere. For a moment, he simply sat there, staring at the child beside him, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions crashing inside him. The brooch, the resemblance, the impossible timing. Every part of this night whispered of something bigger, something fated. The front door opened before he could move. Mrs. Thompson, his housekeeper of nearly 2 decades, appeared in the soft glow of the entryway. "Mr. Durand?" she asked, voice filled with concern as her eyes darted to the bundle beside him. Paul stepped out, the rain immediately drenching his expensive suit, but he didn't care. Gently, he opened the passenger door and scooped Sophie into his arms, her tiny body lighter than he expected. "Prepare the guest room, Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "and something warm for her when she wakes." "Yes, sir." She didn't question him, but the curiosity in her eyes was impossible to miss. She'd seen him return home from countless business trips and board meetings, but never like this. Never with a child, wrapped in his coat. Paul carried Sophie inside, his shoes clicking softly against the marble floors as Mrs. Thompson hurried ahead to ready the guest room. The mansion, though warm and grand, suddenly felt different, less empty, less cold. In the guest suite, Paul gently laid Sophie on the massive bed, tucking the thick comforter around her small frame. She stirred, her brow furrowing briefly as if sensing her unfamiliar surroundings, but she didn't wake. The brooch remained in her grasp, glittering faintly under the soft light. Paul sat at the edge of the bed, eyes locked on the delicate butterfly. His fingers hovered above it, trembling slightly as he touched the edge of its wings. It was real, not a memory, not a coincidence. The same brooch he had once held in his own hands, wrapped carefully in a velvet box, presenting it to Claire beneath the sycamore tree on her 22nd birthday. The same brooch that symbolized promises made and broken. The room seemed to grow quieter, the ticking of the antique clock on the wall growing louder in contrast. He let out a shaky breath and stood, his heart pounding harder than any boardroom negotiation had ever caused. Turning, he walked toward the tall windows that overlooked the rain-slicked grounds. His reflection stared back at him. Older, grayer, warier. Where had all the years gone? He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, allowed the memories to come. The campus lawn was sun-drenched that afternoon. Students sprawled lazily beneath towering oaks, the laughter of youth echoing through the air. Claire had been sitting on a blanket, barefoot, her golden hair catching the sunlight like spun silk. She was radiant, effortlessly beautiful, the kind of woman who didn't seem to realize how much space she occupied in his heart. "Close your eyes," Paul had whispered, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Claire had laughed, playful and curious. "Paul, what are you up to?" "But trust me." She obeyed, and when she opened her eyes again, the butterfly brooch sparkled in her palm. Her breath caught. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing the delicate wings with her fingertip. "I saved for months," he confessed softly. "I wanted you to have something special." Tears shimmered in her eyes as she threw her arms around his neck. "It's perfect." In that moment, he'd believed nothing could ever come between them. But life, ambition, had other plans. Paul's eyes snapped open, his chest tightening with the weight of it all. The job offer in London, the fights, the final, bitter argument that shattered everything they had built. And now, this child, Sophie, with Claire's brooch. He turned back to the bed, watching as Sophie shifted beneath the covers, her small hand still grasping the brooch. So many questions swirled inside him, but one thundered above the rest. Who was this child to him? A soft knock at the door pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway, holding a tray with a cup of chamomile tea. "Would you like me to stay with her, sir?" Paul shook his head. "No, I'll stay." Mrs. Thompson nodded and quietly withdrew, leaving him alone once more. The storm outside had begun to ease, the rain slowing to a soft drizzle. Moonlight pierced through the clouds, casting a gentle glow across the room. The butterfly brooch glimmered beneath the silver light, like a beacon guiding him back to a past he had long tried to bury. Paul sat in the armchair near the bed, his gaze never straying far from Sophie. As the hours passed, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace begin to settle beneath his worry. He couldn't explain it, but somehow, despite the strangeness of the night, having her here felt right. It wasn't long before exhaustion pulled him under, his head leaning back as sleep claimed him in the soft hush of the night. Morning sunlight spilled gently into the room, warm and golden. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. Paul awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Then he saw her. Sophie, sitting up in bed, wide-eyed, clutching the brooch to her chest like a fragile secret. Their eyes met. "Good morning, Sophie," he said softly, offering a small, reassuring smile. She didn't reply, but the fear in her eyes had faded slightly. "Are you hungry?" Her stomach answered before she could, growling loudly in the still room. A faint blush colored her pale cheeks, and Paul couldn't help but smile more warmly this time. "Mrs. Thompson has made pancakes," he offered. "Would you like some?" Sophie nodded timidly. "Come," he said gently, extending his hand once more. This time, she took it without hesitation. As they walked down the grand staircase, Paul felt a strange sensation bloom in his chest, something between protectiveness and hope. The same feeling that had been missing for far too long. But beneath it all, the questions still burned. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them. Claire. He would find her, no matter what it took. Chapter 2. Shocking Revelations. The quiet hum of the espresso machine filled Paul's study as Mrs. Thompson carefully set the tray down on the polished walnut desk. Steam curled from the cup, rising and fading like fragile wisps of thought. Paul barely noticed it. His attention remained fixed on the folder that lay unopened before him. Jack had arrived minutes earlier. The private investigator had always been discreet, highly effective and expensive, but worth every dollar. Tonight, however, his presence carried a different weight, one that pressed heavily into the air. Paul sat still in his chair, hands steepled under his chin. His eyes were sharper than usual, but behind them a storm churned. Jack broke the silence first, clearing his throat gently. "I assume you're ready." Paul gave a tight nod. "Tell me." Jack opened the folder and slid the first few photographs across the desk. Black and white surveillance shots, grainy but clear enough to capture the truth. "That little girl you found, Sophie? She's exactly who you feared she might be." Paul's heart pounded. "She is the granddaughter of Claire Dubois." Paul inhaled sharply, fingers curling into fists. "Claire," he whispered, as if simply saying her name after so many years might shatter him. Jack nodded. "She lives not far from here, actually. Springfield, just outside the city. Quiet neighborhood. She's lived there for years." Paul's pulse raced. He swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "She stayed all this time?" Jack continued. "After you left for London, Claire stayed behind to care for her mother. She raised a daughter, Anne Dubois." Paul froze. His lips parted but no sound came out. "Anne." His mind spun wildly. "Anne Dubois. She has a daughter?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," Jack said softly. "Anne was born 9 months after you left." The words landed like a hammer to his chest. Paul's breathing quickened as the weight of it hit him fully. His daughter. He had a daughter. 35 years, lost. Memories of Claire flooded him like an unforgiving tide. The arguments. The promises. The night he left. And now, the face of a child he had never known flashed in his mind. Anne. As a baby. As a girl, growing up without him. Anne never married, Jack continued gently. She pursued a degree in psychology, followed in Claire's footsteps, and became a counselor. She's struggled, though. Financially. Emotionally. Paul pressed a trembling hand to his temple, the gravity of what he was hearing sinking deeper with every word. "And Sophie?" Jack handed him another photo. Sophie playing outside a modest brick house, her laughter frozen in time. "Sophie is Anne's daughter, 5 years old?" Paul exhaled sharply, closing his eyes as the tears threatened to rise. The little girl in the rain, clutching Claire's brooch, had not only been a stranger, she had been his granddaughter. His blood, his family. For a moment, the weight of everything pressed so heavily into his chest that he thought it might crush him entirely. "How long has she been living like this?" Paul rasped. "Anne lost her job 3 months ago. Claire's been helping, but it's been difficult. Tension has grown between them. The night Sophie ran away was after an argument between Anne and Claire." Paul's throat closed. His thoughts raced back to that night in the rain. Sophie's haunted eyes, her whispered fear, her tiny hand wrapped around the brooch. "My God," he whispered, voice breaking. "All this time, I had no idea." Jack nodded, lowering his voice. "You couldn't have known, Paul." "No," Paul said bitterly, "but I should have stayed. I should have fought for her, for both of them." The room thickened with unspoken regret. Decades of silence now felt impossibly loud. He turned to the window, watching raindrops streak the glass again, just as they had the night he met Sophie. But now, the rain didn't feel like a storm. It felt like penance. For too long he had chased deals, wealth, power, always assuming love could wait. And in doing so, he had missed everything. The first steps, the birthdays, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories, the milestones that should have been his to witness. He had abandoned more than Claire. He had abandoned his own child. Jack shifted slightly in his seat, hesitant but steady. "There's one more thing." Paul braced himself. "I ran a background search on Anne's medical records," Jack said carefully. "She's been receiving treatment for chronic depression, severe in some cases." Paul's eyes snapped to Jack's. "Is she—" "She's managing, but barely. The financial stress, raising Sophie on her own, it's taken a toll." Paul's voice hardened, the protective instinct rising inside him like a flame. "And there's no father listed on Sophie's birth certificate?" Jack shook his head. No record of paternity. She raised Sophie entirely on her own. The room fell silent again. Paul's mind was spinning. So many years stolen, so many moments lost to time and pride. He ran a hand down his face and finally whispered, "I have to see her." Jack nodded. "I can arrange it." Paul shook his head. "No," he said firmly. This is something I have to do myself." He stood slowly, his frame tall but heavy with emotion. For the first time in decades, his next step had nothing to do with business. There was no contract to sign, no merger to negotiate, no reputation to protect. There was only his family, only love, and the chance to finally fight for it. The next morning, Paul stood at the window of Sophie's guest room, watching as the early light bathed the grounds in gold. The world felt impossibly still, like it was holding its breath with him. Behind him, Sophie stirred softly beneath the warm covers. Paul turned and walked over quietly. As her eyes fluttered open, she gazed up at him with the same curious, cautious look that had first captured his heart. "Good morning, sweetheart," he whispered. Sophie yawned and sat up, clutching the butterfly brooch once again, as if it were her talisman against the world. "Are you hungry?" he asked with a gentle smile. She nodded shyly. Paul helped her out of bed and took her small hand in his. As they walked slowly down the grand staircase, a thought pulsed steadily in his mind. She was here because he failed her mother. But he wouldn't fail her. Not again. Chapter 3. Reunion with the Past. The small cafe stood on the corner of a quiet street just outside the city, far removed from the world Paul Durand had ruled for decades. No towering skyscrapers, no chauffeur waiting at the curb, no sharp business suits pacing on their phones. Only the gentle clinking of coffee cups, soft murmurs of conversation, and the faint aroma of fresh pastries warming the morning air. Paul stood across the street, staring at the entrance as though it were a doorway to a lifetime he had abandoned. His heart pounded steadily against his ribs. The last time he had seen Claire Dubois, she was 22, her tearful face lit by a single lamp in their tiny apartment. She had begged him to stay, to choose love over ambition. And he hadn't. Now, 35 years later, he was here to face the woman he'd left behind. The woman who raised his daughter alone. The woman whose granddaughter now slept under his roof. His fingers trembled slightly as he checked his watch again. 10 minutes early. Typical of him. Always early to every meeting except the one that had mattered most. The cafe door opened. And there she was. Claire. She paused in the doorway, scanning the sidewalk, and for a moment Paul forgot how to breathe. The years had carved their soft lines into her face, but her eyes, those familiar, vibrant eyes, hadn't changed. The silver in her hair caught the morning light, and though time had touched her, it hadn't dimmed her. Paul stepped forward slowly, his voice catching in his throat. "Claire?" Her head turned sharply toward him, their eyes locked. Neither spoke. The wind whispered through the trees as seconds stretched into eternity. Paul saw it all flash behind her gaze, the recognition, the pain, the guarded strength. She exhaled first, breaking the silence. "Paul." The name came out like a memory, one that carried both warmth and weight. They stood there for a moment longer before Claire gestured to the small corner table inside. "Shall we?" Paul nodded, following her into the cozy cafe. The bell above the door jingled softly as they entered, and for the briefest moment he could almost imagine they were young again, meeting for coffee after class, stealing hours from a world that never felt big enough to hold them. They sat across from each other at the tiny table, hands resting stiffly on the polished wood. The waitress approached, but neither noticed her presence. Claire spoke first, her voice calm but steady. "You said it was urgent." Paul's throat tightened. "It is." He hesitated, searching for words. "Thank you for meeting me." Claire's expression softened for just a breath before settling back into restraint. "After 35 years, you suddenly want to meet. Why now, Paul?" The ache in his chest sharpened. "Because I found Sophie." Claire's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her composure. She was alone, on the street, in the rain. She had your brooch." Claire's breath caught as she instinctively reached toward her collarbone, as though expecting to feel the brooch still pinned there. "She ran away," Claire whispered, her voice filled with a complicated mix of guilt and heartbreak. "Anne and we had an argument that night. She slipped out while we were fighting." Paul nodded, his voice thick. "I brought her home. She's safe." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Thank you." The silence between them swirled like the steam rising from untouched coffee cups. Paul finally forced himself to ask the question that had haunted him since Jack's report. "Claire. Anne. She's my daughter, isn't she?" Claire closed her eyes, and when she reopened them, there was no more hesitation. Yes. Yes. The single word was a dagger, not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed every ounce of guilt that had been crushing him since the moment Sophie took his hand. His daughter, his child, 35 years, lost to a decision he could never undo. Paul swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. Why didn't you tell me?" The fire finally flickered in Claire's eyes. "When would I have told you, Paul? After you boarded that plane? After you ignored every call? After you changed your number and disappeared?" Paul's breath hitched. "I didn't know you were pregnant," Claire cut in sharply. "I found out days after you left." She shook her head, her voice trembling now. "You left, Paul. You made your choice, and I had no intention of chasing after a man who valued his career more than his family." The raw honesty of her words cut deeper than any accusation. Paul dropped his gaze, shame rising in his chest. "I thought I was doing what was best. For us, for our future." Claire gave a sad, bitter smile. "No, Paul, you were doing what was best for you." The words hung between them like heavy rain clouds. "I wanted to call you so many times," Claire continued, her voice quieter now. "I wanted to tell you about Anne. But every time I picked up the phone, I heard your silence on the other end." Paul's voice cracked. "I was a coward." Claire didn't deny it. "And Anne?" he asked. "She doesn't know I'm her father, does she?" Claire shook her head. "No." Paul closed his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does she hate me?" Claire's eyes softened for the first time. "She doesn't even know you." Paul's voice broke as he whispered, "That might be worse." Another long pause stretched between them. Outside, the wind rattled the cafe windows. "I need to see her, Claire," Paul finally said, his voice steady despite the tears brimming in his eyes. "I need to know her. I need to make this right." Claire exhaled slowly, studying him with a gaze that saw straight through every layer of wealth and power he had built around himself. "This won't be easy, Paul. Anne, she carries wounds you can't see. She's suffered more than you realize. And Sophie? She's in the middle of it all." "I don't care how hard it is," Paul whispered. "I owe it to all of you." Claire's voice softened even further, her strength flickering as her own vulnerability surfaced. "You've missed so much, Paul. She needed a father for so many years." Paul's voice shook as he finally whispered, "I know, and I will carry that for the rest of my life." Tears slipped silently down Claire's cheeks, and for the first time Paul saw the woman behind the strength, the woman who had fought alone for decades, to give their daughter a life. "We'll start slowly," she finally said, her voice barely audible, "for Sophie's sake, and for Anne's." Paul nodded, a tear escaping down his own cheek. "Thank you, Claire." They sat there for a moment longer, two people bound by both love and pain, staring at each other across 35 years of silence. As they stood to leave, Paul paused. "Claire," he whispered, his voice breaking again, "I never stopped loving you." Claire closed her eyes, drawing a long breath. When she opened them again, there was a softness there. Not forgiveness yet, but perhaps. A door cracked open. "Don't say that now, Paul," she whispered. "Not yet. We have a long road ahead." Paul nodded. "I'll walk every step of it." And with that, they stepped out into the cool morning air, side by side, but separated by time. The past had returned, and this time, Paul Durand wouldn't run from it. Chapter 4. The Missing Daughter. The old neighborhood was nothing like the polished world Paul Durand was used to. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven, littered with broken beer bottles and old flyers curling under the weight of rain and neglect. The apartment buildings stood like forgotten sentinels, their paint peeling and balconies rusted, windows partially covered by faded sheets instead of curtains. Paul tightened his grip on the steering wheel as Claire sat quietly beside him, her eyes scanning every face, every corner, as if searching for the daughter she hadn't seen in days. Neither spoke as the Bentley eased down the narrow street. The silent tension between them was no longer about the past. Now, it was the desperate present they were both trying to confront. "There," Claire finally whispered, pointing to a small, tired brick building at the end of the street. Paul pulled up and cut the engine. The hum of the motor died, leaving only the distant echoes of city life filling the void between them. "This is where she's been staying?" Paul asked softly. Claire nodded. "At least, it was." They climbed out of the car and stood side by side, staring at the crumbling facade. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, paint flaking off in thick chips. Graffiti marked the entryway. The air smelled of damp cement and cigarette smoke. Claire hesitated. Paul saw her fingers tremble as she raised her hand to knock. He gently placed his palm over hers. "Let me," he whispered. He knocked. The hollow sound echoed inside. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. Paul glanced at Claire, whose face was slowly draining of hope. She tried the door, but it was locked. Suddenly, an older woman from the apartment next door stepped out, balancing a bag of groceries in one hand and a cigarette in the other. "You looking for Anne?" the woman asked, eyeing them carefully. Claire turned instantly, desperation in her voice. "Yes. Please, have you seen her?" The woman squinted, lowering her cigarette. "I haven't seen her since early last week. Sweet girl, but she's been going through a lot." Paul stepped forward gently. "Do you know where she might have gone?" The woman shook her head. "I know she's been struggling with rent, her job, everything. But lately, well, she looked thinner, pale, not herself. Always worried about her little one, though." Claire's voice cracked. "And Sophie?" "She always made sure the girl was fed," the woman reassured. "But lately it seemed like it was all too much." Paul's heart sank. Claire forced a small smile in gratitude. "Thank you." The woman nodded and disappeared back inside. Claire stood frozen for a moment. Paul watched as her composure finally broke, her shoulders trembling as she tried to hold back tears. Paul reached for her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. "We'll find her," he whispered. Claire's voice was barely audible. "I don't even know where to start." Paul exhaled, thinking carefully. "Jack might have some contacts who can help." Claire nodded weakly. They returned to the car in silence, but as Paul started the engine, Claire's voice broke through. "There's a support group." Paul looked at her, hopeful. "She's been attending a depression support group at the community center, Wednesday nights. She mentioned it once." Paul checked the time. "It's Wednesday," he said softly. Claire's eyes lit up with a fragile spark. "Then that's where we go." The community center stood only a few blocks away. Smaller than Paul expected, its flickering neon sign buzzed faintly as they approached. The building itself had seen better days, but it was warm inside, its worn-out chairs arranged in a circle under humming fluorescent lights. They arrived just as the session was beginning. A handful of people sat quietly, their faces lined with stories too heavy for words. And there, sitting near the edge of the circle, her head bowed, thin shoulders tense, was Anne. Paul's breath caught in his chest. Even though he had never seen her before, he knew instantly. The resemblance was unmistakable. Claire's eyes. His chin. Her long, dark hair fell across her face like a veil, as if she were trying to hide from the world. Claire moved first. "Anne?" she called softly. Anne's head jerked up, her face drained of color when her eyes landed on her mother, and then on Paul, standing behind her. Her mouth opened, but no words came. "Mom, what?" she stammered, standing slowly. Paul's heart thundered as he took a careful step forward. "Anne," he whispered. "My name is Paul." Anne blinked, visibly shaken. Her voice trembled. "Paul Durand?" Paul nodded, his own voice breaking. "Yes." Anne stared at him, the emotions flashing across her face too quickly to process. confusion, fear, anger, pain. Claire spoke gently, trying to steady the moment. "Anne, sweetheart, we've been looking for you." Anne's gaze hardened, tears welling as she shook her head. "Now? After all these years? You show up now?" Paul felt the blow, but he stood his ground. "You have every right to be angry and confused, but I didn't know about you. I didn't know until a few days ago." Anne's voice rose. "You never looked. You never tried." Paul's throat closed as the words struck him like knives. "You're right. I should have. And I will regret it for the rest of my life." Anne's breathing grew quick, panicked. "This is too much." Claire stepped forward again, her voice cracking. "Anne, where's Sophie?" Anne froze. "Sophie," Claire repeated, her tone growing desperate. "She isn't with you?" Anne's face went pale. "I thought she was with you." "No, Anne," Claire whispered. "She's been missing. But she's safe." Paul broke in gently, stepping closer. "She's at my home. I found her. That night in the rain. She's been with me ever since." Anne's knees buckled slightly at the revelation, and Claire caught her before she fell. Paul's voice trembled as he added, "She's safe, I promise." Anne broke into sobs, clutching her mother like a child again. Paul stood back, allowing them the space, knowing he was the outsider now, knowing he had no right to claim anything. After a long moment, Anne lifted her tear-streaked face and looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. Her voice was raw. You're her grandfather." Paul swallowed, his own tears threatening to spill. "Yes, and I would give anything to have known sooner." Anne's lips trembled. "Take me to her." The drive back to the mansion was silent. Anne sat in the back seat, her fingers twisted together tightly. Claire sat beside her, occasionally reaching out to squeeze her hand. Paul kept his eyes on the road, though his mind was racing. Every turn of the wheel felt like a turn in his entire life. As they pulled into the estate, Anne stared at the towering house in disbelief. Sophie was already waiting at the door, Mrs. Thompson standing protectively behind her. "Mommy!" Sophie cried out, running forward as Anne threw open the car door and caught her daughter in her arms. Tears spilled freely as Anne held Sophie tightly, rocking her back and forth as if afraid she might disappear again. "I'm so sorry," Anne whispered over and over, kissing her daughter's hair. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." Paul stood off to the side, his chest tight, watching the reunion, his family, finally together after years apart. Claire moved beside him, her voice soft. "We found her." Paul nodded, blinking back tears. "We did." They stood together in the golden wash of the mansion lights, knowing this was only the beginning. The healing had started, but the hardest part still lay ahead. Chapter 5. Face to face with Anne. The mansion was quiet now. The storm had passed. The immediate fear was over. Sophie was safe. But inside these grand walls, a far more complicated storm had begun to stir. One that had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with the years they had lost. Anne sat stiffly on the edge of the grand leather sofa in Paul's living room, her arm protectively wrapped around Sophie, who was already beginning to doze off in the comfort of her mother's embrace. Her little head rested against Anne's shoulder, her breathing soft and steady. Claire sat in one of the nearby armchairs, her face filled with both relief and anxiety, her gaze quietly bouncing between her daughter and Paul. Paul stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He had faced boardroom battles, multi-billion-dollar acquisitions, hostile takeovers, but nothing had ever made his heart pound the way it did now. The room was filled with silence that felt sharp enough to slice through steel. Finally, Anne spoke. Her voice was calm, but each word trembled with restrained pain. "So, you're the famous Paul Durand?" Paul inhaled slowly, steadying his voice. "Yes, I am. The man who left my mother behind. The man who disappeared from my life before I even entered this world." Every word landed like a blow. Paul forced himself not to flinch. "I never knew," Paul said quietly. "Claire never told me. I didn't know you existed, Anne." Anne shook her head, a bitter smile curling on her lips. That's a convenient thing to say after 35 years. Her words carried no raised voice, no outburst, only a deep, controlled whine that had festered for decades. Paul stepped closer but stopped himself when Anne's eyes narrowed slightly, her guard rising instinctively. "I swear to you," he said, voice tight with emotion, "if I had known, I would have—" "What? What would you have done?" Anne cut in sharply, her voice breaking now. "Come back? Raised me? Loved me? Or would you have stayed in London, still choosing your company, your money, your world, like you chose back then?" Paul's chest tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but how could you justify choosing ambition over love? He couldn't. He wouldn't insult her pain with excuses. Instead, his voice broke as he whispered, "I would give everything I own if I could go back and undo it, but I can't." Anne's jaw tightened. "That's right. You can't. You weren't there for the tears, for the nights my mother stayed awake comforting me when I asked why I didn't have a father. You weren't there for the birthdays, the school plays, the broken bones, or the late nights studying when my head felt like it would explode." Paul felt each word crush against him, one after another. He tried to steady his voice, but it quivered. "Ailed you," he whispered, "in ways I can never fully repair." Anne's throat tightened, tears finally pushing through as she blinked them away quickly. "Do you even realize," she whispered, her voice breaking, "how many years I wished for you, imagined you, made up stories in my head of the father I never had?" Paul's face crumbled. His voice shook as he whispered, "I wish I could have been there." For a brief second, Anne's eyes glistened with a raw, tortured kind of heartbreak. "But you weren't," she said hoarsely, "and I had to grow up pretending I didn't need you." A long silence fell, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between them like a thick fog. Sophie stirred softly in Anne's arms, and Anne instinctively soothed her, brushing a hand through her daughter's hair. Paul watched them, mother and child, and felt the sharp stab of everything he had missed. His granddaughter, his daughter, a family he never knew was his. "I never wanted this pain for you," Paul said, his voice fragile, "and I know no amount of words can erase it." Anne looked up slowly, her voice lower now, heavy with exhaustion. "Why are you here now?" Paul's voice trembled. "Because I finally know. And because I want to be here. For you. For Sophie. For all the years I failed to be." Anne's eyes searched his face, as if trying to see beyond the surface of the billionaire, beyond the wealth, beyond the man she had built in her mind for so long. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered honestly. "You don't just step into someone's life after missing everything and expect it to work." Paul nodded, his own tears breaking free. "I don't expect that, Anne. I don't expect your forgiveness. I only ask for one thing. A chance." "A chance for what?" she asked softly. "A chance to know you, to support you, to help in whatever way you'll let me, and most of all, to not fail Sophie the way I failed you." Anne's breath caught at that. Paul lowered his voice even more. "I can't erase 35 years, but I can show you, with every single day I have left, that I won't abandon either of you again." For the first time since the conversation began, Claire spoke softly from the armchair. "Anne, sweetheart, you don't have to decide everything right now. But maybe we can take small steps." Anne closed her eyes, her body shaking gently with the sobs she tried to hold in. She opened them again and looked at her mother, then back at Paul. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Anne whispered. "Maybe not today. Maybe not for a long time." Paul nodded, voice breaking. "I understand." Anne swallowed hard, her throat raw. "But for Sophie's sake, maybe we can try." Paul's eyes glistened as the words settled into his chest, fragile but real. "Baby steps," she added softly. "Baby steps," Paul repeated, his voice almost cracking. Claire smiled gently, blinking through her own tears. "That's all we need." Sophie stirred again and opened her sleepy eyes, looking up at her mother and then at Paul. "Grandpa Paul?" she whispered drowsily. Paul smiled softly, his heart twisting in his chest. Yes, sweetheart. Sophie yawned and smiled weakly. I like your house. It feels warm. Tears threatened to rise again, but Paul steadied his voice. I'm glad you're here, Sophie. You're safe now. That's all that matters. The little girl snuggled back into Anne's embrace, falling into a peaceful sleep. The storm had not passed, the wounds were not healed, but in that living room, for the first time in 35 years, the first fragile bridge had been built. A family, broken and scattered by choices made long ago, had begun, finally, to face each other. And somewhere deep inside Paul, a new kind of hope was taking root. Chapter 6. A fragile start. The following morning, sunlight spilled softly into the mansion through tall glass windows, warming the grand hallways that once felt cold and silent. But this morning, something was different. For the first time in decades, the house didn't feel empty. Paul stood quietly in the doorway of the breakfast room, watching a scene he never believed he'd witness. Anne sat at the long oak table with Sophie on her lap, helping her pour syrup over a plate of golden pancakes that Mrs. Thompson had prepared. Claire stood nearby, slicing fresh fruit and humming softly, the same tune Paul remembered from long ago. The tune Claire used to hum while cooking in their tiny college apartment. For a moment, Paul simply watched, as if afraid that the simple beauty of the moment might vanish if he stepped too close. Good morning, Claire said softly, noticing him first. Anne glanced up, her expression unreadable, but calm. Paul offered a gentle smile. Morning. Sophie grinned, waving her tiny hand. Grandpa Paul, we're having pancakes. He stepped closer, his heart warming at the sound of her voice calling him that name. Looks delicious. Anne carefully placed Sophie into her booster seat, then motioned toward the empty chair across from her. There's plenty. You should eat. It was a small gesture, but for Paul, it felt enormous. A silent offering. A beginning. He sat, trying not to let his emotions show. Thank you. Mrs. Thompson poured him a fresh cup of coffee as Sophie chattered about her favorite syrup flavors, her recent school projects, and how she loved the big windows because they let the sunshine dance on the floor. Paul listened to every word, his heart both full and aching. These little details were the kind of moments he had missed with Anne. Now, he was being given a second chance with Sophie. As breakfast wound down, an awkward silence hovered for a moment, as Sophie left the table to play with the coloring books Claire had brought. Anne finally broke the quiet. I spoke to my landlord this morning, she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Paul's brows furrowed. And? They won't hold the apartment much longer, Anne admitted, a hint of embarrassment creeping into her voice. I'm still behind on rent and, well, I don't know if going back is even the right thing anymore. Paul's instinct to jump in immediately was strong, but he forced himself to stay calm, to respect her boundaries. I want to help, he said gently, not as charity, but as family. Anne's eyes lifted to meet his. I've been independent my entire life, Paul. I raised Sophie by myself. I worked jobs I hated to keep a roof over our heads. And now, the idea of relying on anyone, especially you, scares me more than you know. I understand, Paul said sincerely, but letting someone help isn't weakness, Anne. Sometimes it's an act of strength. Claire nodded softly from across the table. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore, sweetheart. Not anymore. Anne hesitated, biting her lip as her defenses wavered. I don't want Sophie to feel unstable again, she whispered. She deserves better. Paul's voice was steady. Then let's build better together. Anne exhaled a long breath, like she was slowly lowering a shield she'd held up for years. I don't want handouts. You won't get handouts, Paul reassured her. But I can offer stability. For you, for Sophie, a safe home. The space to build whatever future you choose, on your terms. Anne fell silent again, the battle raging quietly inside her. Claire reached over and placed a comforting hand on her daughter's arm. Baby steps, Claire said softly, echoing the words from the night before. Finally, Anne nodded. Okay, we can try. For Sophie's sake. Paul smiled faintly, grateful for even this small opening. Thank you, Anne. The days that followed were filled with both awkwardness and fragile warmth. Anne and Sophie moved into one of the guest suites in Paul's mansion. The rooms were luxurious, far more extravagant than anything Anne had ever lived in. But Claire helped her feel less overwhelmed, gently reminding her that this wasn't about wealth, but about safety. Paul took care not to hover. He knew that earning trust would not happen overnight. Instead, he found small ways to quietly be present. Reading bedtime stories to Sophie, cooking simple meals alongside Claire, listening when Anne spoke about her fears. He never pushed. He simply stayed. One afternoon, Paul found Sophie in the music room, the room he hadn't entered for years. She sat cross-legged on the floor, staring wide-eyed at the grand piano. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows, making her small figure glow like a painting. Paul paused at the doorway. "The piano's been lonely for a long time," he said gently. Sophie turned to him, her eyes bright. "Do you know how to play, Grandpa Paul?" Paul smiled sadly. "A little. I used to play for someone very special." "Can you show me?" Sophie asked, her voice full of childlike hope. Paul hesitated only a moment before walking over and sitting on the polished bench. His fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant, as if afraid the notes might betray him. But when he finally pressed down, the melody came back, slowly, an old love song, one Claire used to hum. Sophie listened quietly, swaying gently as the music filled the room. When the song ended, she clapped her hands. "That was beautiful!" Paul smiled, his throat tight. "Thank you, sweetheart." "Will you teach me?" she asked. "I would love that," Paul whispered. Later that evening, Anne found him sitting alone on the back terrace, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. The sky was awash in shades of pink and amber, the world bathed in gentle peace. Anne stood silently for a moment before speaking. "You played the same song my mother used to hum when I was little." Paul looked up, startled by her presence. He nodded. "I wrote it for her when we were in college." Anne walked slowly toward him, sitting down in the chair beside him. Her voice was softer tonight, less guarded. "You never told me much about you," Anne said. "Only bits and pieces." Paul exhaled deeply. "Because I hurt her. Because I wasn't the man she deserved." Anne studied him quietly. "She still loved you, you know. Even after everything." Paul swallowed hard, his throat burning. "I never stopped loving her either." The silence between them settled, not uncomfortable, but heavy with emotion. Anne glanced at him again. "You're not who I expected." Paul gave a small, sad laugh. "I imagine not. I thought you'd be cold, arrogant, distant." "And instead?" Paul asked carefully. Anne hesitated, her voice almost vulnerable. "Instead, I see a man trying. Flawed, yes, but trying." Paul met her gaze, emotion rising in his chest. "That's all I can offer now, Anne. To keep trying. For you, for Sophie, for your mother, for all of us." Anne's shoulders softened slightly, her face illuminated by the fading sunset. "And I'll try too." It was a quiet promise. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but nary real. A fragile start. In the weeks that followed, their tentative coexistence slowly began to shift into something that felt like family. Anne started attending therapy sessions again, with Paul covering the cost but never bringing it up unless she did. She also began considering returning to her field of psychology, something Claire encouraged gently. Sophie continued to thrive, her laughter filling every hallway of the once sterile mansion. And for Paul, every bedtime story, every shared breakfast, every conversation was like breathing life into places inside him that had long been frozen. But he knew this was only the beginning. The real challenges were still ahead. And he was ready. Chapter 7. The Business Betrayal. The boardroom of Caldwell Holdings stood as a cold monument to everything Paul Durand had built. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, gleaming with the kind of success that once defined him. The massive mahogany table reflected the sharp faces of the board members, each waiting for the meeting to begin. Paul sat at the head of the table, his tailored navy suit pristine, but inside, the weight of the last few months pressed heavily on his shoulders. He was no longer the same man who once ruled this room with quiet, ruthless confidence. His empire still flourished on paper. The numbers were strong, but his heart? That had shifted entirely. And some had begun to notice. The door opened sharply. Veronica Caldwell entered, crisp, poised, calculating. She offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes as she took her seat directly opposite Paul. "Shall we begin?" she said smoothly, glancing around the table. Paul nodded. As the meeting progressed, reports were presented. Quarterly earnings, market forecasts, upcoming acquisitions. Everything looked excellent, on the surface. But then Veronica spoke again, her voice slicing through the carefully controlled air. "There's one matter we need to discuss before we adjourn." Paul's gaze lifted to meet hers. She laced her fingers together with calculated calm. "Your recent distractions." A heavy pause followed as subtle glances flickered around the table. Paul's jaw tightened. "Be more specific, Veronica." She smiled thinly. "Your personal situation, bringing unknown family members into your private residence, shifting significant funds into private trusts, and recently, significant charitable investments, without full board consultation." The room grew still. Paul kept his voice even. "My personal life remained separate from this company." "Does it?" Veronica asked, voice soft but dangerous. "Because when your personal life involves transferring assets, launching new foundations, and diverting resources, it directly affects shareholder interests." Paul leaned forward. "The foundation is fully financed with my private wealth." "Not company funds." Veronica didn't blink. "That may be true, for now. But let's not pretend your sudden involvement with this newfound family isn't causing concern. Investors are beginning to ask questions. Your focus, Paul. Your stability. Caldwell Holdings has always thrived because of your discipline, but now?" She let the implication hang in the air. Paul's voice dropped, cold and sharp. "You're suggesting that because I've finally taken responsibility for my family, I'm unfit to lead." "I'm suggesting," Veronica replied, "that emotional entanglements cloud judgment. And when one man's distractions threaten an empire, it's the board's duty to intervene." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Several board members shifted uncomfortably but avoided eye contact. Paul exhaled slowly. "Let's not pretend this is about fiduciary responsibility. This is about power." Veronica's smile was tight. "It's about stability." Paul stood, his voice steady but thunderous. "Stability is not found in men who sacrifice everything for the illusion of control. Stability is found in leaders who know what truly matters. I built this company brick by brick, sacrificing everything, including my family, for decades. I will not apologize for choosing to finally be present for them now." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "Then perhaps it's time the board considers whether your personal choices are compatible with the company's future." Paul locked eyes with her. "Be careful, Veronica." The meeting ended moments later, but the message was clear. War had begun. That evening, back at the mansion, Paul stood on the balcony, the city lights glittering far below. The cold wind tugged gently at his sleeves as he stared into the horizon, lost in thought. He heard soft footsteps behind him. "It's starting, isn't it?" Claire's voice was quiet but sure. Paul didn't turn. "Yes. They're coming for you." Paul closed his eyes for a moment before whispering, "They've been waiting for an opportunity, and now they think they've found one." Claire stepped closer, her hand gently resting on his arm. "You knew this could happen." Paul nodded. "I did, and I don't regret it." A brief silence followed as they stood together, watching the city that had once been his whole world. "For years," Paul continued, "I thought building this empire would fill the emptiness inside me. But none of it, ever filled the space where you and Anne should have been." Claire looked up at him. "And now?" Paul finally turned to face her, his voice thick. "Now, I'm not afraid to lose it. Not if it means keeping you, keeping Anne, keeping Sophie." Claire smiled softly, though her eyes shone with tears. "You're a different man than the one I lost." Paul's voice cracked. "Because I finally know what's worth losing everything for." Downstairs, in the study, Anne sat reviewing some job listings on her tablet. Sophie was curled up beside her, fast asleep. The soft glow of the fireplace flickered across the room, wrapping them both in a fragile cocoon of warmth. Anne's eyes flicked up when Paul entered quietly. She set the tablet aside. "Rough day?" Paul offered a weak smile. "You could say that." Anne studied his face, the tight lines around his eyes, the heaviness in his shoulders. "You're in trouble because of us, aren't you?" Paul shook his head gently. "No. I'm in trouble because of choices I made long before you ever came back into my life." Anne's voice wavered slightly. "You don't have to do all this for us." Paul stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Yes, I do. You are my family. I failed you once, I won't fail again, no matter what it costs." Anne swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She looked down at Sophie, running a hand through her daughter's soft hair. "She adores you, you know," Anne whispered. Paul's voice cracked. "She saved me, Anne. You both did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was no longer sharp, but tentative. Two broken souls learning to trust the space between their wounds. "You don't have to trust me yet," Paul whispered. "But I hope, in time, you will." Anne finally looked up at him again, and for the first time, the anger wasn't there. Only something softer. A fragile start. Later that night, Paul sat alone in his private office, reviewing a file Jack had delivered earlier. Inside were documents, copies of emails, whispered rumors, backroom conversations. Veronica's plan was already unfolding, quietly pressuring investors, planting doubt, undermining him behind closed doors. Paul rubbed his temples. He had weathered corporate wars before, but this time, the stakes weren't just his company. They were his family, his second chance, his redemption. He wouldn't lose them. Not again. And for the first time, Paul Durand, the man who once built walls so tall no one could reach him, realized that love, not ambition, would give him the strength to fight. Chapter 8. Sophie's illness. The wind had shifted again. The days had grown colder as autumn settled heavily over the city. The mansion stood wrapped in gold and amber leaves, but inside, the warmth of family had slowly begun to fill its once empty rooms. Until that morning. Paul sat in his study, half listening to the soft melody of Claire playing the piano in the distance, when Anne burst through the doorway, her face pale, eyes wild. "Dad!" she gasped, voice trembling. Paul shot up from his chair, heart racing. "What's wrong?" "It's Sophie." The words alone stole his breath. Anne struggled to catch hers, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She woke up, burning with fever. She can't stop coughing. She can barely breathe. Paul was already moving. "Call the hospital." "I did. They're sending an ambulance." Anne's voice broke as tears welled in her eyes. "She's getting worse." Paul reached her in 3 strides and gently held her trembling arms. "Listen to me. She'll be okay. We'll get her to the hospital. You did exactly the right thing." But even as he spoke, he felt his own chest tightening. The fear in Anne's eyes reflected the terror in his own. When the paramedics arrived, Sophie was barely conscious, her tiny body limp as they strapped her onto the stretcher. Her flushed cheeks glistened with sweat, her chest heaving as each shallow breath rattled painfully inside her small frame. Paul and Anne rode behind the ambulance, gripping each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Claire followed in a second car, her own tears silently falling as the city rushed past her in a blur of lights. At Springfield General, everything moved too fast. The doors burst open and Sophie was whisked inside. Nurses shouted orders, monitors beeped rapidly. Machines hummed and clicked as doctors hurriedly assessed her. "Severe pneumonia," one of the doctors explained to them quickly, his face grim but focused. "Her lungs are inflamed. We need to stabilize her oxygen levels immediately." Anne's legs buckled, and Paul caught her before she could fall. "I want to stay with her," Anne sobbed. "You can, ma'am, but please, let us work." They led Anne and Paul to a small glass observation room as a team of specialists surrounded Sophie's tiny bed. Wires and tubes snaked around her fragile frame. Oxygen hissed softly through the mask secured over her mouth and nose. Paul had faced hostile corporate takeovers. He had stood in front of flashing cameras and unforgiving boardrooms. But none of that had prepared him for this, for standing helplessly behind glass watching his granddaughter fight for breath. The little girl who had called him Grandpa Paul. The little girl who had somehow healed a lifetime of regret simply by smiling up at him. And now she was slipping away. The hours dragged mercilessly. Night fell, and still they waited. Claire sat beside Anne, her arms around her daughter as Anne silently wept. Every so often, Anne would rise and pace anxiously, returning to the glass window to check Sophie's monitors. Paul stood quietly behind them, fighting his own storm inside. When he couldn't stand still any longer, he quietly slipped out into the corridor. Jack was waiting for him there, as he always seemed to be, loyal and silent. "Any updates?" Jack asked gently. Paul shook his head, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Nothing yet." Jack studied him for a moment. "You need to prepare yourself. This is out of your hands." Paul's voice cracked as he whispered, "I can't lose her." The words weren't about Sophie alone. Not really. Jack placed a steadying hand on Paul's shoulder. "You won't. Not this time." Around midnight, the lead physician finally approached. Anne leapt to her feet. "Doctor, we've stabilized her for now," he said, exhaling deeply. "Her oxygen levels are improving, but she's still very weak. The next 24 hours are critical." Anne collapsed into Paul's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Paul held her close, his own tears silently falling into her hair. The family took turns sitting by Sophie's bedside throughout the night. In the dimly lit ICU, the world outside seemed distant and irrelevant. Around 4 a.m., Anne sat slumped in the corner chair, fast asleep from exhaustion. Claire was resting nearby, equally drained. Paul sat alone beside Sophie, gently holding her tiny hand. The beeping monitors kept their steady rhythm, but her breathing was finally calmer. Her little eyes fluttered open, just barely. Paul leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Sophie." Her lips moved beneath the oxygen mask. "Grandpa Paul," she mouthed softly. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Her eyelids trembled and a tiny tear slipped down her cheek. Paul gently squeezed her hand. "You're so brave. You rest now. We'll all be waiting when you wake up again." Sophie closed her eyes and drifted back into sleep. Paul sat motionless, letting his silent tears fall freely now. By morning, Sophie's condition had slowly begun to improve. The doctors delivered cautious optimism. The worst had likely passed. Anne, Claire, and Paul stood together in the hallway, a small triad of exhaustion, relief, and something stronger. Something none of them spoke out loud yet, but all felt, growing between them. They were no longer broken strangers trying to rebuild old bridges. They were holding each other up, as a family. Later that afternoon, as the soft autumn sunlight poured gently into Sophie's hospital room, Paul sat once again beside Anne, who gently ran her fingers through her daughter's hair. Anne's voice broke the silence. "When I was young, I used to pretend you were out there somewhere." Paul looked at her carefully. "I imagined you'd knock on the door one day," Anne whispered, her voice fragile. "And you'd say you made a mistake, that you wanted to know me. But I also convinced myself that would never happen. I built my whole life not needing anyone." Paul swallowed, his voice thick. "I know I don't deserve this second chance." Anne looked over at him, her eyes softer than ever before. "But you're here." Paul nodded slowly. "And I always will be." Tears gathered in her eyes, but this time, they weren't from pain. For the first time, Anne whispered, "Yeah." Paul's breath hitched. The word landed in his chest like a fragile gift, one he'd never expected to receive. He couldn't respond. He simply reached out and held her hand. And as the monitors softly beeped behind them, the deepest wound between them, though not fully healed, was no longer bleeding. Chapter 9. A Father's Redemption. The crisp autumn air was thinner that morning. The sun rose gently over Paul's estate, casting soft gold across the manicured gardens. Inside the mansion, life had settled into a new kind of fragile normal. Sophie was back home, still recovering, but stronger every day. Her laughter once again echoed through the halls, breathing life back into spaces that had stood silent for too long. Anne and Claire spent quiet mornings with her, reading stories, playing games, drinking coffee together in the kitchen, as though decades of distance were finally softening, one tender moment at a time. But Paul knew something still lingered beneath it all, something unresolved. The unspoken truth that had haunted him for months now. The question he could no longer push aside. Why did I ever leave in the first place? For years he had accepted his own version of events. The job offer, the opportunity too big to refuse, the promises made to himself that he would return later. But as he looked at Claire now, as he watched Anne hold her daughter at night, something gnawed at him. Something didn't add up. And so he made the call. Thomas Hartley arrived that afternoon. Paul's former mentor, his once closest advisor, the man who had guided him through his earliest years in business. They hadn't spoken in years. Now, as Thomas stepped into Paul's private office, he looked older, thinner, his hair completely white, the confident sharpness in his eyes dulled by time and, perhaps, regret. Paul motioned toward the chair across from him. Thomas did, his hands folding tightly in his lap. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, not angry, but charged. Finally, Paul broke it, his voice low. "Tell me the truth, Thomas." Thomas blinked, pretending not to understand. "About what?" Paul's gaze sharpened. "You know exactly what." Thomas exhaled deeply. "Paul, no more games." Paul cut in, his voice controlled but hard. "You pushed me to London. You made it feel like I had no choice. But I've spent the last few months piecing things together. That offer wasn't as urgent as you led me to believe, was it?" Thomas dropped his head slightly, rubbing his temples. "It was an opportunity you earned." "That's not what I asked." Thomas hesitated. The words came slow, reluctant, as though each one scraped something raw inside him. "I pushed you," he admitted finally. "Yes. I forced your hand." Paul felt his stomach tighten. "Why?" Thomas looked up, shame deep in his eyes. "Because I saw how distracted you were becoming. With Claire. With that relationship. You were brilliant, Paul. Ruthless. Focused. But love? Love was making you soft. Emotional. And in this business, emotions are weakness." Paul's jaw clenched. Thomas's voice grew quieter. "You could have been one of the greatest. And you were. But only because you left. Because you made the smart choice." Paul's fists trembled on the armrests. "You manipulated me." "I guided you," Thomas insisted weakly. "I did what I thought was best for your future." "No," Paul said, his voice breaking. "You didn't do it for my future. You did it for yours. For the company. For your own legacy. I trusted you." Thomas closed his eyes, his shoulders sinking. "And I failed you." Paul stood, walking to the tall windows overlooking the garden where Sophie now played with Claire. His voice was raw. "Because of you, I lost my family before it ever began." Thomas looked down at his trembling hands. "I've watched you from afar for years. I saw what that decision did to you. And to them. I carry that guilt, Paul, every single day." Paul turned back to face him, his voice quieter now but filled with sorrow. "You stole 35 years from me, Thomas." Thomas nodded. "I know." The room was thick with regret. The kind that time could not erase. Paul finally exhaled deeply, his voice surprisingly steady. "I can't change what happened, neither can you. But I won't let that past destroy what I have now." Thomas met his eyes, tears glistening. "You've built something beautiful, Paul. You still have a chance to make it right." "I will," Paul said. "And you're not part of it anymore." Thomas stood, his voice cracking. "I don't deserve to be." Paul nodded once, dismissing him with a quiet finality. "Goodbye, Thomas." And with that, his former mentor, the man who had shaped so much of his life, walked out of Paul's office and out of his life for good. That evening, Paul sat quietly on the back terrace, staring into the violet dusk. Claire joined him after a while, sitting close, the silence between them warm now instead of sharp. "You look lighter," she said softly. Paul exhaled, his voice almost fragile. "Because I finally know the truth." Claire waited as he told her everything Thomas had confessed. By the time he finished, tears shimmered in Claire's eyes. "You never chose ambition over me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You were manipulated." Paul's voice cracked. "But I still left. I still didn't fight hard enough to stay." Claire reached for his hand, her voice tender. "You were young and scared and guided by people who didn't deserve your trust." Paul closed his eyes, his heart heavy and full all at once. "I wish I could take it all back," he whispered. "I wish I could have held you, known Anne from the very beginning, watched Sophie be born." Claire squeezed his hand. "We can't rewrite the past, Paul, but we can still write the rest of the story." Paul turned, his eyes filled with raw emotion. "Do you think we can?" Claire smiled softly. "I think we already are." Inside the house, Anne stood near the staircase, having overheard much of the conversation. She stood there quietly for several minutes, her heart full of complicated emotions. And slowly, for the first time, she no longer saw the powerful man who had once left. She saw her father, the one still standing, trying, fighting, not for himself, but for her. Chapter 10. The New Beginning. The mansion's garden had never felt so alive. It was early spring now. The long, hard winter had finally loosened its grip, and fresh green buds peeked out from the trees surrounding the estate. Warm sunlight spilled across the stone terrace, where a small gathering had begun to form, one that, just months ago, Paul Durand could never have imagined. A white tent was erected near the center of the lawn, its silk canopy swaying gently in the breeze. Tables were decorated with fresh lilies and pale blue linens. Soft music drifted through the air from a string quartet tucked beneath the oak trees. Today was Sophie's 6th birthday. But it was more than that. It was a quiet celebration of something far bigger, of survival, of forgiveness, of family finally finding its way back to itself. Paul stood near the edge of the tent, watching as Sophie raced across the grass, giggling, her long dark hair trailing behind her like a ribbon. Anne was close behind, laughing freely, a sound Paul never grew tired of hearing. She had found her footing again, stronger than ever. Claire approached him from behind, slipping her hand into his. Her touch was warm and steady. "You did this," she said softly, smiling as she watched the scene before them. "No," Paul whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We did." Anne's recovery had been slow but steady. With Claire's constant presence and Paul's unwavering support, she had returned to her studies, pursuing her passion for psychology again. This time not out of desperation, but out of purpose. Sophie, too, was thriving, a bright, curious child who somehow carried a piece of all of them inside her. The mansion, once a monument to Paul's isolation, now breathed with life again. Laughter in the hallways, late-night conversations by the fireplace, small rituals of ordinary family life that filled his heart in ways no business victory ever had. As the party continued, Paul stepped forward when Claire gently nudged him. "It's time," she whispered. Paul cleared his throat, calling softly to the gathered guests. His voice trembled slightly at first, but as he looked at the 3 generations standing before him, Claire, Anne, and Sophie, his strength grew. "Family and friends," he began, his voice carrying across the garden. "A few months ago my world was very different. This house was quiet. My days were filled with meetings and contracts, numbers and transactions. But today, as I stand here, I realize that all of that was hollow." He paused, his voice thickening. "What truly matters is here. In the laughter of my granddaughter, in the resilience of my daughter, in the grace of the woman I never stopped loving." Claire's hand squeezed his gently. Paul turned toward Sophie now, his voice softening. "Sophie, when I first met you, I handed you an apple," he smiled, "and you handed me back my entire life." Sophie beamed, giggling as the guests laughed gently. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He turned to Anne first, his voice shaking. Anne, you are my greatest gift, even though I didn't know it for so long. You are the bridge that connects my past to my future." Anne blinked back tears, clutching Sophie's hand. Then Paul knelt before Sophie, opening the box to reveal the familiar gleam of the butterfly brooch. The same brooch that had once set everything in motion. "This brooch once belonged to your grandmother Claire," Paul explained, his voice trembling. "It was given to her out of love, a love that never truly disappeared. It found its way to your tiny hand that night, as if reminding me of everything I lost, and everything I still had the chance to build." He smiled softly, fastening the brooch to Sophie's dress. "And now, my sweet girl, it belongs to you. A symbol that no matter how broken something may seem, love always finds a way home." Sophie threw her arms around Paul's neck, whispering in his ear, "I love you, Grandpa." Paul closed his eyes, holding her tightly, his heart breaking open in the most beautiful way. As the evening settled and the guests departed, the family remained outside beneath the soft glow of string lights. Anne approached Paul quietly while Sophie sat on Claire's lap, dozing beneath a blanket. "Dad," she whispered. Paul turned, the word still stirring something indescribable in him every time she said it. "I wanted to tell you something. He waited, listening carefully. "I've decided," Anne continued, her voice stronger now. "I want to open my own practice, a small family counseling center. Help others the way you and Mom helped me." Paul felt a rush of pride swell in his chest. "That's wonderful, Anne." Her voice wavered slightly, "but I can't do it without some help." Paul smiled gently. "You will have every resource you need, not as a gift, but as an investment in you, in Sophie, in the lives you'll touch." Anne nodded, tears brimming. "Thank you for everything." Paul reached out, pulling her into a hug. For the first time, she didn't hesitate. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Paul and Claire remained on the terrace, watching the stars scatter across the velvet sky. Claire leaned her head on Paul's shoulder, her voice quiet. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Paul's voice broke softly. "I only wish I'd made it sooner." I smiled, reaching for his hand once more. "We found our way. That's what matters." They sat in silence for a while longer, wrapped in the peace of second chances. Finally, Paul spoke again, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "Claire, I have one more promise I'd like to make." She lifted her head, eyes searching his. Paul stood, reaching into his pocket to reveal a small ring box, one he'd carried with him for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I lost you once," he whispered. "I won't lose you again. Will you marry me, Claire?" Claire's eyes filled instantly, but her answer was steady, filled with quiet joy. "Yes, Paul." As they embraced beneath the stars, the past, all its pain, all its regret, finally softened into something new. Not forgotten, but forgiven, the promise of tomorrow. Years passed. The mansion, once a silent monument to isolation, had become something entirely different. Its halls now echoed with the sounds of life. Laughter, conversation, quiet music drifting in the evenings. It was no longer a house. It was a home. Paul sat beneath the sprawling oak tree in the garden one late afternoon, watching as Sophie, now 10 years old, raced across the lawn, her hair flowing behind her like a banner of light. Her butterfly brooch caught the sun with every step, glimmering like it always had, a symbol of everything they had lost and everything they had found again. Claire joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She sat beside him on the bench, resting her head on his shoulder as she always did now. They didn't speak for a long time. They didn't need to. In the distance, Anne stood near the swing set, pushing Sophie gently as her daughter's laughter filled the air. Behind them, the counseling center Anne had built, with Paul's help, stood tall on the edge of the property. A place that welcomed others who had lost their way, offering them a chance to heal, just as they had. Paul let out a quiet breath. "Do you ever think about how close we came to missing all of this?" he asked softly. Claire smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Every single day." He reached for her hand, their fingers interlacing. "We lost so many years, Claire. But we found each other again," she whispered. "That's all that matters now." Paul nodded, his voice barely above a breath. "For a long time I thought success was about what you could build, what you could own. But none of it means anything without the people you love standing beside you." Claire leaned into him, her voice filled with quiet warmth. "Real wealth isn't what you put in the bank, Paul. It's who comes home to you at the end of the day." As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold, Paul watched the family he never thought he would have. He had spent decades chasing power, driven by ambition, believing that love could wait, that there would always be time to come back to the things that mattered most. But time, he learned, wasn't something you could control. It moved forward whether you were ready or not. And when you finally opened your eyes, you might find that what you left behind had already slipped through your fingers. And yet, sometimes, by grace alone, life offered second chances. Not perfect ones, not easy ones, but real, honest, and worth fighting for. Paul knew he could never rewrite the story of his past. But sitting there, surrounded by the people who had once been shadows in his mind, he understood something now. Something he wished he had understood when he was young. It's never too late to fight for the people you love, and no amount of success means anything if you stand at the top of the world alone. As Sophie jumped off the swing and ran toward him, giggling, Paul opened his arms wide, lifting her into the air as she squealed with delight. The sun slipped behind the trees and the stars began to blink awake above them, scattered like promises across the night sky. And in that moment, Paul Durand finally felt something that no fortune had ever given him. Peace. Sometimes we spend so much of our lives chasing success, thinking love can wait. But when we finally stop and look back, we realize the only thing that ever truly mattered was who stayed, who loved us in our absence, and who gave us the courage to begin again. It's never too late to fight for family, and sometimes the most beautiful stories are not the ones without pain, but the ones that find healing through it.